Now, I think this is kind of an unusual one to do for Twitch because I think creators on Twitch already kind of have a handle on the digital platform. So something like Patreon makes sense to people on Twitch, whether they've made it work or not, or whether they personally are using it or not. The concept makes sense. There's a common language for folks on Twitch to where they get kind of how it works because Twitch is a similar platform in terms of income and interaction and community and all those things that make sense in talking about Patreon. Now, for the authors who aren't on Patreon and aren't familiar with Twitch, which is probably most authors, most writers, this article is kind of more towards them. Like, is this something that makes sense to you? I make a little bit of money off of Patreon, looking to build it up. But the question was, is Patreon still a viable platform and income source for authors? And we're going to take a look at that. This one got shared pretty good, and I'm hoping to get some feedback from some folks on what they've done and what they think. And a few people have commented, and I've looked at their Patreon pages and am learning some things myself. So we'll go into this now. All right, so looking at Patreon, is it a viable platform for authors? Patreon.com is a platform for creators of all types to share work with a dedicated audience in a subscription format. Supporters of particular creators on Patreon are called patrons. Rewards for support can be physical things that are mailed or digital work that is unlocked. Support can begin at as little as $1 a month and moves up through tiers for higher level support and content. Patreon includes pages from visual artists, filmmakers, musicians, podcasters, streamers, adult star only fans, personalities, authors, and more. Patreon came into the consciousness of many in the writing community at an odd time. Today, crowdfunding and direct artist support is more ubiquitous with platforms like Twitch and YouTube Gaming, where gamers are supported by donations from fans. Crowdfunding existed well prior to Patreon, but was not as broad, but not as broadly, and it wasn't as big a part of the writing and publishing world as it is today. Independent authors and small press publishers had just started experimenting with crowdfunding sites like GoFundMe and Kickstarter around the same time many writers began exploring Patreon. Prior to this, the big shakeups in publishing included ebooks, the expansion of self-publishing, the rise of Amazon as the primary distributor of everything. Even with these structural and technological changes, legitimate writing income was largely seen as writing a piece, selling the piece, and being paid as a result of readers buying a unit of the published work. You repeated this process and worked for volume. Many authors were still trying to find their place on social media as a platform for promoting and branding. Many are still trying to figure that out. There was mixed success with crowdfunding in those days. For some indie and small presses, it is still a regular part of funding their anthologies. There is some pushback in writing circles around this, and Patreon sometimes gets swept into those discussions. Even in a world of streaming entertainment, most authors and publishers still think of writing income in terms of writing a book, publishing a book, and people buying singular copies of the book. Does it work? All right. Poll quote here: arguably most authors are not successful with Patreon, but that's true of everything in writing. We're all working to be the exception. Okay, so the question for the second section of the article: does it work? Many authors found no success on Patreon, especially at the beginning. We understood subscribing to Netflix, but why would someone subscribe to an author monthly? Wouldn't I just buy their books if I was interested? A number of writers abandoned the site when they got no supporters, and they then distributed the work they'd accumulated on there in other ways. Some of us stuck it out, sometimes putting up work for no one or only one or two patrons. There is a theory about the first follower. If one person does something, they are just some weird guy doing something alone. If a second person joins in, then it becomes a thing in other people's eyes. More people are likely to join in, and it builds from there. That concept plays out everywhere. So a good example is there's this video of a festival and some guy is just dancing in a field and he's just dancing by himself. Then another guy gets up and starts dancing with him. Once the two of them are dancing, more and more people start standing up, and it becomes this huge thing where everybody's dancing in this giant group. And so the first follower is really important, because once it's two people doing it, then it looks like a thing. Oh, this is a thing to join in. It's just not some lone weirdo doing something. It's more people joining in. So that concept plays out everywhere. It plays out in how many people are viewing a Twitch video. It plays out in how many people are joining Patreon. It plays out in how many people watch videos that are shared and reshared and things of that nature. So that idea of first follower is a big deal. It's a barrier to getting more people to see that this is a joinable thing. I make a little bit of money from Patreon, and I'm working to build that up in terms of quality of content offered and number of supporters. My page is patreon.com/jwilburn. The way I approach Patreon is I offer a robust range of content to all patrons. Everyone, including the people at the dollar level, get a lot of stuff. I have found that people who pay more than $1 are really interested in supporting the person, investing in you rather than in the stuff. Most of them aren't looking to get a lot of stuff mailed to them. They are probably exceptions to this generality, of course. People who support on Patreon are generally interested in access. They view previews of material before anyone else, exclusive work just for them, behind the scenes items, and special connections to the creator. It is possible to set up chats and live streams, and that works well for people who have a lot of supporters. Giveaways are sometimes good and can build loyalty and value. People like a page with lots of content, but most often new patrons look at what is new instead of going back to read everything. If you have no supporters agree to come on for $1 a month and you don't know how to get them to, it is tough to argue the platform works for you. What can I offer? There are a number of things authors have commonly offered on their Patreon pages. Serialized novel. Each month you post a new chapter. Eventually you can edit and publish the novel for the public as well. Short stories. A lot of readers enjoy a quick read without having to order an entire collection. They can read a short story you posted especially for them, along with everything else you offer. They can read it on the site or in their email. Behind the scenes, this can mean a lot of things, from seeing first drafts, works in progress, story pitches, details others don't get, and more. Previews, being able to see things before anyone else, is a big perk of being a patron. Exclusive videos. Seeing and hearing from a favorite creator when no one else can is something special. The better you get at creating videos, the more appeal they have, but a simple video can still build a feeling of connection between you and your patrons. Videos of readings for them can work too. Direct access. Ultimately, someone who pays monthly is investing in you. They believe in you as a person as much as they do your work. You don't have to pull back the curtain on your entire personal life, but you can share things that help make patrons feel that they are a part of a community as they support you. Tangible rewards. You can create something physical that you can mail to patrons as either a one-time perk or a regular thing. Armand Rosamilia has a tier where supporters get to choose a book monthly for him to sign and mail. This is in addition to all the other content he offers. Things unique to you. All the suggestions above seem great, but if these things are common among those successfully using Patreon and those who never get a single patron, this may not help at all. The X factor is what is unique to you. What skills do you have to offer that no one other author can? Jessica McHugh creates blackout poetry. Some authors are also visual artists, podcasters, musicians, or have some other interests that can lead to unique content. I'm fairly prolific. I offer months where I post a new short story every day for the entire month. I usually do this in October and December. John Urbansek is a prolific short story writer and offers many great stories monthly and did a full month one September too. I podcast and I'm on Twitch. I've started editing video content with a little better quality, including unique material from some of the authors I interview, along with writing I created live on video. Soon, I'm doing a collaborative project with another author on Patreon. All right, how are other authors making it work? I can share what I've seen on some of the Patreon pages I personally support. So all these examples, not all the examples that are on Patreon, but these are people I support personally, and so I can tell you what's on their Patreon page. Brian Keene switched his Patreon to a single tier. You can support him for any amount of money, but his only tier is the $5 level. At that level, he offers something every single day. Sometimes it's behind the scenes, some days are serial novels. He shares short stories and more. He indexes everything from his Patreon at his website for easy access and discovery. Keen's uniqueness comes from years he has written in a wide range of genres and also the place he holds in the horror community. He has a lot of stuff he can share, and other writers will follow him for his insights. Armando Amelia offers serial novels, short stories, and behind the scenes on what he is writing every day, each week. He holds a position of mentoring several authors, so many people are interested in what he does and how he does it. John Urbansek is an accomplished author and photographer. He shares his work from both mediums on his site, and his work never disappoints. Perpetual Motion Machine Publishing offers subscriptions to the work they produce, early access to podcasts, writing prompts and editing, and exclusive written content. Crystal Lake Publishing offers a lot on their Patreon as well. Publishers may have more resources than an individual author, but you can borrow ideas or take inspiration from what they do. They have writing advice, flash fiction contests, previews, exclusive author interviews, and an exclusive horror series with multiple writers and more. Is it worth it for authors without a huge following already? All right, so this is the big question. An author with thousands of fans willing to join their page really doesn't have to ask whether it is worth it. So the real question is whether Patreon offers a platform that is worth it for an author building an audience. That's a tougher question. For any platform, there are some core questions that need to be answered first. Do you have the time and desire to develop a vibrant Patreon page? If the answer is a hard no, then you are out. Next, can it be integrated or complement the work and platforms you are already using? If the answer is yes or even maybe, then there may be potential here for you. If writing one chapter a month on an extra novel fits your schedule, you can use that and have another book for release down the line. Old trunk stories or old published stories can provide content. Patreon is a good laboratory for experimenting with stories or writing styles that may not fit anywhere else, but patrons like to get something new, weird, different, and special. You might not sell that piece, but writing it anyway for Patreon gives you practice that may be valuable later. All right, this is something I use Patreon for. So one example is that I wrote two versions of a fairly long story. One that I was going to submit to a publisher, and then one that used similar characters in a different way, different type of apocalypse, different type of story. Now, obviously, I could not publish both stories because they were too similar. And so one of them went on Patreon. It was a big, long story, but because I couldn't use it for another publisher, I was able to use it there. I've also used Patreon when I'm like experimenting with a new genre, one that I'm not real successful with yet. And even though the story is imperfect and it's not probably good enough to go to any anthology yet, it's the kind of thing that I can share on Patreon because the supporters there like to see process. They like to see things that are new. They like to see things that they're not going to get anywhere else. So a lot of times the weird stories, the incomplete stories, the imperfect stories, the experimental stories that may not have a home yet, they may be part of a stepping stone to me writing something more elevated that works later, but it's not ready yet. And so a lot of times those are the kind of stories that I share on Patreon, and a lot of times those are the kind of stories I get the most feedback on. Dropping back into the article where I was, you might not sell that piece, but writing it anyway for Patreon gives you practice that may be valuable later. If you create content for other platforms and can share it early on Patreon, that works. I use podcasts. The podcasts I do, I'll share early on my Patreon page. I'll share clips on the Patreon page that I'm not sharing other places, that sort of thing. A lot of times I'll share blog posts early. So if I'm writing a blog post for my own site and it's going up on a Thursday, I'll share it the week before on Patreon, or even in some cases months before, and they get to see it there before anyone else. And a lot of patrons really enjoy that, I know. Create content for other platforms and can share it early on Patreon, that works. If you have the ability to create content in advance, schedule it out, and then maintain it as you work ahead, then it may not be overwhelming for you. How much is enough to make it worth it for you? Talking about Patreon. Looking at the work you need to put into it, along with what you're already doing, is a couple supporters enough to keep you working on it and building it? Is it worth it to have no supporters for a while as you create content to draw them in? If you could build it up to a steady $100 or $200 a month, is that worth it as you work to build up from that plateau? If the answer is no to these questions, then you're probably out. I answered yes to these questions, and I'm in the process of building up my Patreon. It works with my other platform development, and I'm experimenting with ways I can use it differently and promote my traditionally written work as well. Arguably, most authors are not successful with Patreon, but that's true of everything in writing. We're all working to be the exception. Patreon is part of that effort for me. All right, so that was my article on Patreon. Again, for a lot of content creators on Twitch, some of this information is redundant because they already think in terms of the digital platform and subscription format and building community and all the things that other authors who aren't on Patreon, aren't on Twitch, it may be alien to them. They may still be locked into the traditional forms of publishing alone and not have expanded out into some of these arenas that people watching this on Twitch would be familiar with. But again, this is an idea that a lot of authors could play with, and as I've said with Twitch, I like to see what other authors do. The majority of people I follow on Twitch are writers, and I like to see what they're doing, what they're creating, how they're using the platform, ways that I can get ideas from them, ways that I could develop my own ideas, jumping off of something that they're doing that I may be able to apply to something unique about me as a writer. So hopefully these articles and sharing this on Twitch and YouTube is helpful for people, and I look forward to talking to everybody again soon.